Thank you. Thank you, George, and thank you, everyone, for having me. I'm so pleased to be here. And gosh, I first of all have never heard my resume read out loud like that before. And the things that I write in the dark of my room when I'm putting together my blog read in public, it's really kind of alarming. But thank you for your good graces. I'm going to get started, and I'm going to show you a lot of material because unfortunately I just can't make things concise, so I'm just going to try as hard as I can. Please bear with me. Are you able to hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. Can we bring the lights down perhaps just a little bit? Thank you. So as George mentioned, oh, maybe I should turn this on so you can see me. There we go. Okay, we good?
Yes.
Great, okay. So as George mentioned, I have done a lot of different projects in a lot of different kinds of venues. And I would like to point out that this is as much by design as it is by necessity. This is a challenging field to work in at the best of times, certainly a field that is frequently impacted by economic ups and downs. And what I've learned in my 13 or so years of work experience is that you just have to find ways to work all the time. And things sort of sort themselves out. They generally do. I've been very fortunate that way, but even if it doesn't look like the next thing coming is apparent, I try to work with the assumption that it will all figure itself out as long as I'm continuing to produce. So that's been a lot of my strategy. I was also asked to speak briefly about my curatorial philosophy, which I try to keep fairly open-ended, but I will say that it's my belief that contemporary art is really for everybody. Not every contemporary art work or artist is for every person, but rather contemporary art is so broad, so all-inclusive, so malleable and flexible, that it really can be stimulating for anyone who chooses to engage with it. And that person or that group of people can engage irrespective of educational background, ethnic background, cultural context, provided that certain elements are in place. And I'll illustrate a little bit how I approach that as I proceed. But ultimately, my goal in my work is not only to make contemporary art really accessible to as many people as possible, but also to make the exhibiting world or access to exhibitions as inclusive as possible as well, so that a broader representation of artists and makers is also included and not exclusively a diverse audience being catered to by a less than diverse artist population. So these are challenging goals, and I wouldn't say that I've succeeded. I would say that I'm always trying. So my earliest work as a solo curator was at the Richmond Art Center, where I started to work shortly before graduation from the MA program in curatorial practice at CCA in 2005. The Richmond Art Center is a small nonprofit with a now 75-year history. It was founded as part of the Works Progress Administration initiatives. And originally it was actually a one woman on her bicycle with an art supply kit, tooling around the city of Richmond, which was at the time largely populated by employees of the Kaiser shipyards who were building ships for the World War II effort. It remains a predominantly African American community. It remains a low-income community, particularly hard hit by the dissolution of those Kaiser shipyards in the 1960s, and from then on, there was really no industry, and it's been trying very hard to climb back as a community, plagued with quite a lot of problems, and also a lot of economic disparity. In the hills where I live, it's fairly middle class. In the flats, it's pretty poor and suffers from a lot of conflict. So we have to try to address all of this in working on exhibitions at the Richmond Art Center at the same time as it is a long-established hub for contemporary art practice, and so it's important that the practices that are represented not be exclusively community-oriented, but rather combine and bridge two often different ways of working. So this was the challenge that I tried to resolve in this exhibition. I'm just going to quickly show you a couple of shots from this. So my goals here were to keep the exhibition as much a workshop and as much a living space, an interactive space as possible. Of course, this is coming out of graduate school, where my head is now filled with notions of social practice and interactivity and access and participation, making your audience into makers. And how do we do this? And so this was my way of processing all of that. So the artists involved ranged from object makers whose objects were somewhat non-traditional, especially in their use of space, as you can see here from this dress, where the sleeves can actually be configured in any number of ways, and my decision was to emulate the spiral jetty. So in that way, I thought I could turn this piece of fabric-based art into a sort of a non-site. And that was a curatorial decision. There were performative pieces, such as the tent in the back, where the artists actually wore the dress portion of the tent. They're called dress tents. Inside the tent is a video of the artwork being performed in another location, so that you could engage with it from the inside or from the outside, and that way it was both a sculpture and a performance. A number of these projects were making projects. You can sort of see here in the background Lucrezia Troncoso creating friends. She called them friends, these stuffed creatures made out of people's used clothes that they would bring and contribute to the project. So materials were being donated by the public. Some of these objects, such as the white forms, cardboard forms that you see on your right, are wearable. These were actually made by an animator that I knew who was also very into making costumes for Burning Man. So again, trying to bring a practice that was not a contemporary art practice, but that was a contemporary art practice into this dialogue as well. And by allowing people to try on the clothes and the outfits, the costumes, the objects, and ultimately their sculptures, it became both an object exhibition and not an object exhibition, and that was my goal. What you see here is the work in its static form, but over the course of exhibition, these pieces would move and change. And one of my favorite moments in this show, the moment when I decided that I thought it was working, was when a mother and her 2 teenage daughters came into the exhibition space. Not art people. One of the things about the Richmond Art Center is they offer art education classes and programs as well, and this is in a community where school art programs have been all but eliminated. So the Richmond Art Center's education programs have actually replaced art programs in elementary schools. So this family was there because one of the daughters was in one of these classes learning to make collage or painting, and they stopped into the gallery afterwards, and at first they sort of just looked around, and the mother started making some kind of funny comments, and the daughters were looking at her with absolute disdain, as teenagers do. And within about 5 to 10 minutes, I saw things change in their dynamic. The mother put on one of the costumes and she started goofing around, and again the daughters were a little bit put off at first, and then they got into it, and then they started putting on the costumes, and then within a few minutes they were all playing with one another. And that cynicism, that distance between generations had at least momentarily dissolved. That's what I'm trying to do. I feel like if you can experience the work, you can transcend any lack of formal knowledge, because it really does speak for itself. And then you get it. I mean, I think this is all about conceptual art, participatory art. What it's about is not that abstract, really, if you can experience it. So that's the way I try to work. So this was sort of, I think of this as my MA thesis show. I did a thesis show with my class. There were 11 of us. We had to agree on one show. So believe me, I know how hard EDS is because I've been through it. This was my opportunity to take that to the next level and really work these things out on my own. So here, the Cafe for the Interactive City, the C4F3, which I did as a member of the curatorial committee for 01 San Jose Global Festival of Art on the Edge, which I also served as associate producer on this festival of public art using technology in interaction in the city space of San Jose, California, which is also where I had the pleasure of meeting Guna. And I worked on that festival for about 6 months in a period of time after working at Richmond Art Center before moving on to the Headland Center for the Arts. And it was possibly the most intense 6 months of my life. In the course of the month of July, before the festival opened, I probably put in about 2 months worth of hours. We lived down there. It was really trial by fire. And an incredibly rewarding experience. And one of the great things about 01, which continues to be a biannual festival in San Jose, is that because so much of it takes place in public space, it's presenting very cutting-edge art using interactive technologies to a largely non-art audience. In this case, we were actually working in an art space. We were working in the San Jose Museum of Art. But as often seems to be the case when I work in museums, I don't work in the museum. I work sort of near the museum. So we were in the cafe in the Education Center. And our goal with this project was to preserve the integrity of the cafe experience. People were ordering coffee and having snacks and sitting and eating. And at the same time, all of the projects should engage with that experience. So they were about communication and the different kinds of activities that you would engage in if you were in a cafe, such as reading the news, such as consuming food and drink, writing notes to yourself. We kept it kind of broad. But the idea was that everything would flow with the experience of the space, and that the space would be, although in an art institution, not really an art space, primarily a cafe space. So it was a bridge between the interactive city, the public installations that were out in the street and in the plaza outside the museum, and the exhibitions of interactive and digital art that were inside the museum galleries, which were more traditional in their presentation. We tried to create a space that was a hybrid of the two, almost a transitional space. So for example, here we're looking at two projects. One, and also we had a light and a dark space, it bears noting. The dark space was necessary for any sort of projection-based installations. The light space was the cafe proper, where the concessions actually were sold. The upper image is a work by John Malia, and it's called Transcriptions. You write a line of poetry or improvisational language on the typewriter, and it turns it into an audio composition. So you're both composing in language and composing in sound at the same time as a participant in this work. The lower image is a work by J.D. Beltran called Secrets, and these small monitors were embedded into tabletops throughout the cafe and hidden either by coasters, salt shakers. We tried to make them as invisible as possible so that as you sat and consumed your meal and you moved things around on the table, you would discover them. And when you discovered them, you would be privy to short films, silent films with subtitles. The subtitles came from a website that J.D. ran, where she invited people, much like the Post Secret website, to tell her anonymously things about themselves that they didn't think people generally knew or didn't generally want people to know. And then the video images were not necessarily related, but they were juxtaposed in a way that became quite poetic. So that was a wonderful piece, because in this moment of sitting there, you experience something poetic and transcendent while you went around the mundane business of consuming your lunch. Trying to catch people off guard, this is a big part of what I do. It's challenging when you work in galleries, which I often do. So this is the show that I did at NIAD, which I'll quickly talk about. NIAD is one of three, it's the first of three venues in the Bay Area, along with Creative Growth in Oakland and Creativity Explored in San Francisco, that are nonprofits dedicated to making arts therapeutic and accessible for people with severe mental and physical disabilities. They're all situated in low-income communities. They all attract very diverse populations, and people with really serious, often debilitating disabilities, both issues such as schizophrenia and severe depression, and Down syndrome, paralysis, and so on. So predominantly, NIAD is not about a professionalized or market-oriented approach to art. However, they are very much engaged with the art world, especially because increasingly NIAD artists, and even more so Creative Growth, Creativity Explored artists, are being invited to participate in exhibitions at venues such as White Columns in New York. So they have a challenge. how do we preserve the integrity of what our clients do, they call them their clients, and protect them from some of the cruelties of the marketplace and exploitation, especially since these are people who can't necessarily advocate for themselves, and at the same time allow them the public exposure that collaboration with contemporary art venues can afford them. So in this case, what I did was I wanted to think about how you would combine an exhibition of professional artists with an exhibition of non-professional artists whose approach to art making was very different, and reason for art making might be different, and that might be as essential, because what I thought was, well, perhaps their reason for art making is not different. Is particularly if you think about artists who work in abstraction, perhaps what they're really trying to do is get past all of the socialization, all of the rationalization, all of the intellect, etc., to a point that is more intuitive and more direct. And in some ways, the people who are working past their severe disabilities are working in that way of directness that these other artists are aspiring to. So this was the idea behind the title, Beyond Explanation, Automatic Abstraction, was to get to a point of automatic creativity that was not being filtered so much through the consciousness, that was not so much about articulation or explanation, but really about just the experience of applying material to material and letting images generate themselves out of that. So I invited 4 artists in the community who were teaching artists to participate and exhibited work of theirs alongside work of client artists, but also a number of collaborations, and we're looking at 2 of those here. So in the interest of time, I'll just rush on. Skipping ahead a little bit. Close Calls is an exhibition that has been retitled a number of times, but continues to exist in some form or another at Headlands Center for the Arts. Headlands is a residency program situated in the Golden Gate National Reserve, a federal park in the Marin Headlands, just off the Golden Gate. It's an extremely beautiful area. It also used to be a military installation. It was an army base back in the World War I, World War II period. The buildings were all built around 1907. The main buildings at Headlands were barracks buildings that housed about 50 enlisted men each. And then the artists' housing is in what were the officers' quarters, which are these beautiful Victorian homes that line the parade ground. So it's a really unique site, and also a site that presents challenges. The residency program attracts about 1,000 applicants a year and is able to accommodate about 40 of them. So the Close Calls program was originally initiated as a kind of acknowledgement of the local community of artists who would apply and be rejected year after year after year. This poses a problem. A number of artists told me, why would I want to be in the Thanks But No Thanks show? Many more, though, really wanted to be in the show because of the level of exposure that it grants. But for me, I didn't want it to be the Also Ran show. I really wanted for it to have a theme and a logic all its own to be to really, increase the advantage for the artists participating. So my theme was nature versus nurture. So I'm just going to show you a few projects. It was a very large show, and it varies. Some years it's only 10, but for me, I felt like we've got the space. We should really include as many people as possible. This is about inclusion. So that was my approach. I'm showing you particularly site-specific work because the site itself is so beautiful and so loaded with historical context that for me, the most exciting projects were really the ones that engage with that space. So here we're looking at Seth Cohen on the left. Seth works in crocheted yarn. And this piece hung from the top of the 3rd floor, actually the 4th floor attic, and hung down to the 2nd floor. And it provided a kind of a visual cue, a minimal visual cue that would lead you up the stairs, because the show actually took place on the 3rd floor. And so for practical reasons, the 2nd floor is an installation by the artist David Ireland. So it's a place that people usually find their way to. They'll get to the 2nd floor and they'll engage with the architecture there, and then they'll sort of get stuck. Now what do I do? So having this work was actually a way of leading them up the stairs to the show itself. and giving you a little bit of a preview so that you started to get into the spirit of it before you even walked into the gallery. Then when you walked into the gallery, you encountered this work by Christine Lee, and it's called Shims, Thousands of Uses. I think this one was use 6. What she does is she takes new cedarwood shims, and she's very concerned with the fact that this is new wood, most of which, when it's used for its original intended purpose in construction, actually gets broken off and thrown away. So she takes these shims, buys them at the Home Depot, makes these installations, allows them to have a life as an artwork, dismantles them, and then takes the whole lot and donates them to Habitat for Humanity. Just trying to get a little bit more use and life out of this new wood before it ends up inevitably in the trash. And also to call attention to the fact that all of the architectural spaces that we inhabit every day have these unseen components that we may not be aware of. This is work by Amy Rathbone. The challenge in this work was that we had a wall that had been opened for a required sprinkler system installation, and they didn't get around to closing it and doing the inspection in time for the show. And fortunately, I was working with Amy, who's an incredibly adaptable artist and someone who's really interested in the intrinsic nature of architecture. So she embraced the opportunity to work both inside and outside the wall. She made this installation of these incredibly delicate, continuous marks done, again, in a sort of an automatic style. And at the same time, she embedded objects into the wall. And when this panel was finally sealed up after the inspection and after the show, those objects stayed there. So it became a kind of a response to the fact that this architecture is embedded now with 25 years of artist activity and artist presence that transforms the space in unseen ways. So even though the drawing portion was painted over, the sculpture portion of this work will, in theory, last forever. But no one will know. Finally, the last project I want to tell you about in this show was this work by Liz Hickok. So Liz is best known for working in Jell-O, and she does installations of architectural spaces both based in fantasy and based in reality in molded Jell-O, and then she photographs them, and she gets this wonderful illuminated quality. But for this installation, she was experimenting both with Jell-O and with a more permanent material of gel wax that had much the same effect when cast. So she created this three-dimensional map of the Mission District in San Francisco. The Mission is a neighborhood that is historically Mexican-American and historically low income, and that has become increasingly trendy and attracted more and more young people over the last 15 to 20 years. And so she's making a comment about the encroaching gentrification in this work, in which the more affluent parts of the neighborhood are cast in gel wax and the low-income parts are cast in Jell-O. In the beginning, everything looks the same. Over the course of a month, the Jell-O parts deteriorate and shrink and decay, and the gel wax remains pristine. And over that time, she's also making a time-lapse film of the process, which was then exhibited at a later date. So part of the reason for doing this was to talk about this neighborhood, which is actually not far from the Headlands, although the Headlands is in a pristine rural environment. It's only about 15 minutes from the city of San Francisco. So to remind us that while we're in nature, we're also engaged with culture and society. Also, because of the fact that this work ultimately ends up as a film, but the film is not actually what we're showing. What we're showing is the sculpture that in process becomes the film. It was a nod to the fact that this is an artist studio residency program, and what we do there is not about the final product as much as it is about the process. So I wanted to preserve that even in the exhibition format. So every exhibition starts with a challenge. In this show, the challenge was that the Iranian-American artist Taraneh Hamameh and I were invited to curate an exhibition for the Asian Pacific Islander Cultural Center's United States of Asian America Festival. And as you might guess from an organization called the Asian Pacific Islander Cultural Center, they tended to be very, very, very focused on everything to the east of China. So we had great representation from the Philippines, great representation from Japan, from China, from Korea, from Vietnam, and almost no representation from South Asia or anywhere in Central Asia. And they asked us if we would fill that gap, but what they said is, you know, it'd be really great if you did a Middle East show. And the response that we got, that we had, and also that we got from all the artists is, why would I want to do that? So we had this challenge. Do we do the show? Do we not do the show? If we don't do the show, someone's going to do the show. And if they do it, they're not going to ask this question, why would you want to do that? What is the Middle East? What does that even mean? Nobody in the Middle East thinks they're in the Middle East. And if you look at a map from the mid-19th century, the heyday of the British colonial empire, the Middle East stretches all the way into North India. And now if you look at a map, it sort of ends arbitrarily with the edge of Iran, even though really Iran flows into Afghanistan, flows into Pakistan, does flow into North India. So we were really stuck as to where do you draw the line when you call it the Middle East? And does the Middle East include Israel? And does the Middle East include Egypt, which is in the Middle East supposedly, but in Africa and not in Asia? And this is the Asian American Festival. So these were all these questions, these problems that we were mulling over, and we thought, well, let's just do the show. And that way we can ask all these questions, and we can struggle with, well, if you're in the Middle East, that implies that something is west of you. But we are in California, where everything is east of us. So that's where the title came from, East of the West. The other challenge that we had in this show was that we had a local budget and an international idea. So how do you do that show? This is Tarabat Talipasand. So unfortunately, the way that it shook out in terms of the best images I had to truncate this show to show you, most of the artists you're going to see are Iranian. I confess the majority of artists in the show were Iranian, but they weren't all Iranians. And so I just want to let you know that. But you're going to see a few of them right now. And of course, this was 2008, so Iran was on everybody's minds. Today it's Egypt. 2 years ago it was Iran. A couple years before that it was Iraq. So it tends to bounce around. We had representation from all of these cultures. Tarabat, like several of the artists in the show, and like myself, has an Asian background, but she herself is an American, born and raised in this country. And her work is all about how she reconciles her very California sort of personality. She's very much a California girl. She's very free-spirited, impulsive, and not really an Iranian woman in that sense. She's certainly not someone who's inclined to cover her head in public. And yet she has cousins, relatives, family in Iran, and she goes back periodically, and she has to pass. And so her work is about passing in both contexts, in feeling American and looking Iranian in the United States and all the implications of that, and then in looking Iranian but obviously being American. And you can tell that from a mile away. As people have told me in India, I saw you walking down the street and I knew you weren't from here. It's just in your gait. So there's no way to hide it. You just are what you are. In these images, she's using fabrics that are laden with symbolism. On the left, it's the scarf that Ahmadinejad wears, that he identifies with his legitimacy as the proper kind of Iranian representative. On the right, it's what they call the Palestinian martyr scarf, which was increasingly popular as an accessory among mission hipsters at the time. And so she's wearing them both as a kind of a fashion, also as a kind of a challenge. And she's drawing her own face, but then with this mask of the skull, because she herself sees this kind of decay and a kind of a joke in a sense. It's also a bit influenced by Mexican traditions, which she is perhaps more familiar with growing up in San Francisco. That the death is something that you acknowledge, but it's also something that you sort of laugh at. The grinning skull of the Day of the Dead. That's very much what she's using here. So it becomes a cross-cultural reference where her identity is part of it, but it's not everything in the work. It's obscured and masked as well, and the masking is what it's all about. So this is a work by Ali Dadgar, and Ali represents the only use of a chador or head covering in this show. as a guy. So we were really happy about that too. We wanted to make sure that that image was there because you were seeing all these images coming out of Iran of these women in these black drapes. But he wears it as a kind of fool gesture. He's playing a buffoon or a cultural outcast, generally dressed in boxer shorts and the chador, and traveling the world as the ugly American masked as an Iranian, which is essentially how he feels. So in this work, he is the good and the bad, the black cowboy and the white cowboy. And also, he's showing us a worldview, a different worldview than the Western-centric view. In this case, it's a worldview that shows us that the only two countries that count are the United States and Iran. If you're in the US, you think only about the US, and if you're in Iran, you think only about Iran. This is a video by Esam Mahalov, an Iraqi-born artist who came to the United States during the first Gulf War in the early 90s. As a young teenager, she moved to Los Angeles. And she has always identified with her Iraqi heritage. And at this moment, in the thick of the Iraq War, she made this video called Black Gold, in which her body produces this endless font of this black substance. I believe it's chocolate, but it's meant to symbolize oil. And so it's this kind of gagging that she's experiencing. It's not a pleasant sensation. And the stream trickles, and then it becomes full again, and then it trickles. And in doing so, she equates her own body with her ancestral land and the endless draining of resources in that country with a kind of purging or almost an anorexia, a bulimia rather, of society. It's pretty uncomfortable to watch. This is a work by Egyptian artist Osama Dawud. So the way we were able to represent him was he was actually at the San Francisco Art Institute doing his MFA, and he's back in Egypt now. So he did this work called Post No Bills, and it is kind of a non-site. So for those of you who are familiar with Smithson's notion of the non-site, I imagine that's most of you, and this work points to another work in public space. So this is in the gallery, but it indicates a life outside the gallery. What he would do is he'd make this mark, write this in Arabic in this case, meaning Post No Bills, referring to construction sites and the barriers around construction sites that generally form a kind of temporary architecture, that are themselves an urban blight, but that then they do not want further blighted with in part democratic voice. And so this is in the gallery, and then it also exists somewhere in public space that he would not tell us where it was. The idea was that you would find it by accident. And he also did a number of poster installations, wheat pasted, on sites that were not supposed to be wheat pasted on, as part of this installation. And again, they were guerrilla projects in public space. So the only indication in the gallery was this marking. And of course, it's not in English, it's in Arabic. The intention being to obscure the meaning. And I think I need to hurry up, I'm probably running out of time. But when he does this project in the Arabic-speaking world, he always writes it in English. So he wants to make sure that the understanding is not clear, that it's really about the mistranslation or the loss of meaning. So quickly here, two works, one by Ala Abtekar and one by Taraneh Himami. The work on your left by Ala is about being an Iranian from the United States, going to Iran and engaging with youth culture and finding, for example, that Ahmadinejad, who no one really likes among the young, but his coat, the coat to Ahmadinejad, was a popular fashion item in around 2006 among the young. The very people who despised him were also appropriating his appearance. And then on the other side, Taraneh Himami doing the opposite, looking at Iranians in the United States and how they've made a life for themselves in this new cultural context. This one I wanted to show you, even though it's a terrible picture, because it is by the artist Taha Bilal, and it's particularly timely at the moment. Taha is also an Egyptian, although he has one American parent and one Egyptian parent. He's also back in Egypt right now. This is images from the daily newspaper of the Mubarak regime, Al-Ahram, in which only the official symbol, the headline, and the advertising are preserved. And this work is about the fact that the way that the Mubarak regime has propped itself up all these years is by obscuring information and promoting consumerism. So who cares if you have a leader whose interests are in line with yours? What really matters is that you have a Rolex watch. And that's what these pieces, including the video, are all about. And finally, this is a work by Hadi Tabatabai, another Iranian-American artist. This is an artist who does not identify in his practice with any sort of cultural specificity or Islamic context at all. He is, thank you, he's an abstractionist in the Western model. He apprenticed with Agnes Martin. He sees himself in the trajectory of American minimalism. And yet, there is something about these objects that really relates to the traditions of Islamic architecture. And it's there. It's not overt, but it exists. And I think these objects are particularly interesting to me because you can bring multiple readings to them, and all of them are consistent with what the object is, even if they're not consistent with each other. And this is one of the ways I think that I strive to bring Western artistic precedents into dialogue with outside cultural influences, because I think in fact they always have been. If you think about the origins of minimalism, they really do come from American artists and European artists engaging with Zen thought, with Islamic architecture, with the elimination, the idea that you would represent something in the abstract, that you would remove all traces of representation, is very much in line with the doctrine that says that you will not make any graven images. Whether that doctrine is a Christian doctrine or an Islamic doctrine or anyone else's doctrine, or comes from Zen thought. And so I think it's important to reflect that. It comes back around. These are not new ideas, but really it's about pulling out some of the ideas that have always been there and bringing them to the forefront. So I need to hurry through some of this other stuff, which I apologize for because there's a lot more to show you. This show is about work-life balance, and it was the first show I did at UC Berkeley, and it's on everybody's minds. So several examples of artists exploring the realities or the difficulties of work-life balance. So I'm actually going to skip ahead and just show you guys a couple of quick video excerpts. This one's called I Will Replace You by Jennifer and Kevin McCoy, based out of Brooklyn, currently in Abu Dhabi. And in this work, what they're trying to do is reflect on the fact that as teachers, as artists, as parents, they just don't have enough time in the day. So they decided that the thing to do would be to outsource. So they hired a number of actors to play them as they went about their daily lives. And of course, it would help if it actually started. If it doesn't, I'm just going to skip it. Okay, I'm just going to skip it. So what you're seeing here, that's all right, I'll show you an image, is variations on their daily lives. It's their own children, it's their own home, and yet they're swapping themselves out for other people in every aspect of their lives. And sometimes you have one of the artists with an actor playing his partner or her, Jen's best friend with all these different people, including Jen, interacting with her about their day. So there's a lot of real people in their lives interspersed with these performers giving artist talks on their behalf, taking their kids to the park, and so on. It's sort of an idealized, well, wouldn't it be nice if we could just split ourselves into thousands of people? I mean, I think we all feel that way. And then this is another work that really inspired this project, was this work Reborn by Desiree Holman. And I'll show you it a little bit. So what Desiree is doing is she's working with craft practices that are internet-based. So she's interested in technology mostly as how it creates communities. In this case, she found out about a community of what's called reborners. They're largely Midwestern, largely middle-class women, usually older with grown children, making baby dolls, newborn dolls, from catalogs. They order them part by part, put them together, hand paint them, hand root all of their hairs, all of their eyelashes, install little pumps that make their hearts beat, and it is a community. Then they get on these forums on the internet and they talk about this process and their supplies and their engagement with this artistic practice. Desiree got very interested in this. She started making these dolls. But for her, they're a little bit distorted. One of them has 2 heads. One of them's kind of sallow or jaundiced. They're not the idealized babies that the movement itself tends to create. And then she took it a step further and she thought about empty nesting and how a lot of these practices, or in this case, this practice fills a void for these women. And so she took these dolls and she put them in the hands of another group of women who are childless, only these are women who are younger, who are childless by choice, at least for the time being, and who have made the choice that their lifestyles don't accommodate for having a child. So she wanted to connect these two very different groups of people who may not see themselves as having something in common through this work. And at the same time, she's thinking about shame and exposure. This video is kind of MTV derived with the sexy dancing and the bikini bottoms, and at the same time they're wearing these very colorful kind of niqabs over their faces, so that the contrast between the fecundity of the body and the sexualization in media that denies fertility but advocates for sexuality of the female body is played up. And so that this contrast between the shame or the modesty of covering the face and the kind of blatant sexuality of uncovering the body, again, provides a contrast in the work. And of course, the whole thing's done with a dose of humor. So, unfortunately, I can't show you too much more because I'm going to run out of time. So I'm actually going to skip ahead to the next project here. I'm going to skip this one too. I'm sorry. If any of you want to see it, I'll put it up on the web. It was really important for me to get to these last two. This is Transforming Fictions at the Kearney Street Workshop program at the De Young Museum. Again, working in a kind of peripheral space in the museum. This is the De Young Artist Studio, where they have an ongoing residency program. We invited 4 artists, Asian American artists, to participate in this residency simultaneously. Ala Ebtekar, Iranian visual artist, Parini Sundaralingam, Sri Lankan poet and spoken word artist, here collaborating with her violinist partner, Kal Maureen, an Irishman. And then Julie Chang, who's a painter, Chinese background. And finally, Erica Chung Shuk, Korean-American choreographer. So all 4 of them used the space, and they alternated in the space. This is from a performance that we did as one of the events at the exhibition. Here you can see Julie's paintings in progress. So she uses symbols that represent some sort of Chineseness in popular culture, often in a very stereotypical way, and then layers them on top of one another to create these really beautiful abstract compositions that are also based in printmaking and textiles and patterning. And what we were trying to do here was A, to represent the fact that Kearney Street Workshop is interdisciplinary, B, to represent the broad scope of Asian identities, and C, to reach an audience that was not our traditional Asian American audience. So the De Young was trying to increase diversity in its ranks, and in our case, we were trying to increase diversity as well, from the other direction. And here we feel we were pretty successful. We had a mix of generations, we had a mix of ethnicities. The only thing we didn't really have was a mix of socioeconomic backgrounds. Partly that's because the De Young's really hard to get to. So if you're a low-income person, you're kind of out of luck in terms of transportation. Finally, this is Knowledge Hacking, which was the last show that I did at UC Berkeley. And the goal in this case was to use the Research University as a studio for artists, to engage the practice of art with other research disciplines, and to demonstrate why there's a value in connecting artists with researchers in other disciplines, particularly in the sciences. So here we're looking at a model of the limbic system in the brain, a network of brain nodes that process and respond to emotion and artistic stimuli. and that transcends the hemispheric division in the brain. So it's happening. This activity is happening simultaneously on both sides of the brain. This was visualized by a design graduate student at UCLA based on research done by a psychology and neuroscience graduate student at Duke. And they collaborated on this image using 3D visualization software, which is increasingly being used in neurology. The designer, Pinar Yildiz, then used a laser cutter to turn that into a three-dimensional sculpture. And you see here how it expands. It's 1.5 times the size of the human brain, and then extruded into this almost kind of corporeal form that is also at the same time very beautiful and engages us on an aesthetic level. And then she provided this poster that explains the process of the components of the limbic system and its processes of responding to stimuli. This is the mobile plant ambassador. This is a part of a larger project called the Wonderarium. And this cart is a prototype, 17-inch prototype for an 8-foot diameter public art installation of a terrarium containing live plants, which is intended to float in Oakland's Lake Merritt, a man-made lake in an urban center. So it will be a public art project once the money is raised for it, and as a means of building awareness and community support and ultimately, hopefully, fundraising for this project, the Mobile Plant Ambassador was conceived to bring this whole project to communities that might otherwise not get it. So actually, this cart didn't stay in the gallery very often. Most of the time it was out in public space, where people were encouraged to make terrariums. So here we have right in front of the gallery out in the courtyard at UC Berkeley, passersby being invited to come and make their own terrariums and take them home. It's a project of social practice, of gift economy. It involves interaction design, and ultimately it is in the service of public art.
Who are the artists?
The artists are Sarah Philly and Yvette Molina. And in this case, they collaborated with Chris Carmichael, who's on the end here, who is the Associate Director of the UC Botanical Gardens at Berkeley, and Louis Rawlings, who's an interaction designer. So this was a 4-person team led by 2 artists, a social practice artist and a painter. And they, together, these 4 people made this project happen. So we were really pleased because the Botanical Gardens itself became a studio for these artists. Chris Carmichael became very, very involved with the project. He worked very closely with them to determine what kind of plants would survive the extreme conditions of this installation in the lake, to talk with them about the nature of succulent plants and the difference between native plants and sustainable plants in the California drought-tolerant climate, so on. So we were happy about the way that this actually did bridge relationships between university departments and get other scientific research departments on board with the idea of artists stimulating and furthering their research. And in a sense, field testing some of these plants, putting them in conditions that botanists might never think to put them in to find out what would happen. So here we have 2 different systems of distribution. The artists making a terrarium, and doing a demonstration for people to make their own, and a succulent girl who would walk around distributing these succulent plants for free. And each one has a QR code on it, which can be scanned and will take you to a website where you can track your succulent, add it to a database that maps the locations of all the succulents that have been distributed. These are also plants that propagate, so you can cut off a piece, give it to somebody else to plant, generate a QR code for them, and then they can track theirs. So it's an ongoing distributed project. And finally, energy harvesting is public art, which was a means of bringing 2 departments together. Stephen Wilson, the director of the Conceptual and Information Arts program at San Francisco State, and Li Wei Lin, who is the head of the UC Berkeley Mechanical Engineering Department. And I'm sorry to say that this may have been the last exhibition that Stephen Wilson did before he passed. I'm very grateful to have had the chance to work with him. But he brought a bunch of students in to work with Lin and his students, who were developing new technologies, nanotechnologies, that are intended to harvest and store energy and potentia, and then could be, in theory, used to power devices or even cars. It's all theoretical. And this is where we get into the realm of science being not so different from art. It's really a conceptual science project at this point, and it doesn't always work in practice. And in fact, it was not a technology that was not robust enough for the artists to actually use as intended. Again, the intention was for them to sort of field test it under unusual conditions. It wasn't actually that functional, so instead what they did was they theorized it. And they got into the ethical implications of what it meant. So using Arduino technology to absorb movement from a participant's actions and then translate it into these notions of generating power here through what would happen if a painter's paintbrush contained these technologies. How much energy could you generate by making a painting? Here with a glove where you moved the fingers and you registered a reading on the meter and ultimately lit up the necklace through your participation. So just ways of making these very abstract technologies more translatable, more understandable to a general public as a means of communication. And finally, as I think I'm probably right about out of time, I just wanted to quickly show you the next project that's coming up at the Worth Rider. This is called Dislocated. This is a show that came together very quickly in the last month. I'll talk a little bit about challenges as well. I had planned a show with an artist based in New York who did a residency at the Headland Center for the Arts, one which I had nominated her for way back when I was there, which finally came to fruition just in November and December. We were all set to work together. We were really looking forward to it. And then I saw her right after the new year, and she said, you know, ever since I got back from the Headlands, I haven't been able to make a thing. I'm just so overstimulated, so drained. I know I'm moving in a new direction. I haven't had a chance to really process it. I just don't know what to make. And so I had to let her off the hook and find another way to do a show. That opens February 16th. So fortunately, I had another project, and so working around that project, the entire show got reconfigured and became something else. And it's part of working on the fly, which you just have to do sometimes in this work. So this is a project called I-140 by Nomi Talisman, who you see here, and D. Hibbert Jones. It's about how Nomi has been trying to get a green card for many years. Her life partner, Dee, is a naturalized citizen originally from the UK, but of course they can't get married. So she can get no legal rights to stay in this country. She can adopt a child, which they did during this process, and yet she could still be denied for a green card. And she was forced to apply under an extremely restrictive category of application called a person of extraordinary abilities, which is the artist visa. And basically the long and short of it is if you haven't already got a MacArthur, good luck to you. They had to get something like 90 letters of recommendation. It cost them, ultimately there's something like $25,000 in debt. And so they decided to do this project where they went out into the public space, this is at LAX, holding these signs, letting people know what's going on with them. And in that way, they're also connecting their experience to that of other people who are marginalized in society, people who are homeless, illegal laborers, and so on. And so the relationship, the fact that you're here and at the same time politically you're not wanted, your life is here but you're politically not wanted, that became the core of the show. That's why it's called Dislocated. So this is a project by Yumna Shala and Gianno Gossi. Yumna is originally from Beirut, and Gianno was originally from Kabul. And Yumna now lives in New York, and Gianno lives in Germany. They were invited to do this project. They called it Home Sweet Home in Jerusalem, in the apartment of a woman who is a Palestinian woman, and she has to keep this apartment and pretend to live in it in order to keep her work papers to legally work in Israeli Jerusalem. Meanwhile, her husband is denied permission to work and live in Jerusalem. So he lives in the West Bank. So she lives in the West Bank. But she has to keep the apartment, otherwise she will lose all of her work. So they are running this sort of ad hoc residency where artists come in and live in the apartment. And so they staged and played with all the objects that staged this space in contemplation of what this fictional home is really all about, and what it means to have a home one place that allows you to have your real home somewhere else. And again, here is a situation where someone's needs emotional needs, personal needs, their life, and their political situation do not mesh. And finally, Katie Miranda, an American Jewish artist from San Francisco who is an illustrator and comic book artist who is in the process of making a comic about her experiences working as a volunteer with Palestinian children in the West Bank. And how she came to understand the situation in a very different way than we understand it through the news. And again, how people's lives in this case are on hold because of political realities that are beyond their control. Both their own leaders and the leaders of the opposing side really not fulfilling their responsibilities to the people. And so these three projects, the idea for me was to try and do this kind of triangulation. It's not about pointing fingers, you're at fault and you're not, but rather to say, no matter who you are, where you're from, you can be in this situation. That political realities are everywhere. And so that's what I'm about to open when I get back to California. And I'm going to leave it there. There's plenty more that I could show you, internet shows, public installations, and so on. But unfortunately, the documentation of that is often a lot more challenging. So feel free to ask me about practices outside the gallery as well. Thank you. Thanks for your time.